Welcome to this Friday's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm the director of the forum and a member of the Providence College Philosophy Department. I'd like to extend a special welcome today to those of you who are visiting for the weekend's events. I'm delighted that you all could join us this afternoon. We have a very special event this Friday for the Humanities Forum. We are hosting the PC Debate Society and a Cambridge-style debate on majority rule. This is hosted by two of our faculty members here from PC, as well as three members of the Debate Society. I'm going to say a little bit about them for a minute or so, and then I'll hand the mic over to them, and we'll be off for the afternoon. Our first guest here to my right, Professor Colin King. Professor Colin King is an associate professor in the philosophy department here. He studied philosophy, classics, and political theory in Freiburg, Lille, and Berlin, and has his PhD in ancient philosophy from the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. He works on the history of ancient philosophy and science, in particular on Aristotle's theory of argumentation, but he's also active in the voting reform movement in the United States, and some of you may know he was instrumental in helping Maine pass a voting reform bill a couple years ago. Professor Adam Meyers, also two over here from Colin, is an assistant professor in the political science department. He earned his PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin and has been at PC since 2014. He conducts research in the areas of American state politics, political parties, and political history. Noah Gemma, all the way on the end, is a senior philosophy and theology double major here at PC. His favorite topics to think about are ethics and apologetics, and he's been a part of the PC Debate Society since his freshman year. Patrick Reynolds, just to the right of Colin King, Professor Colin King, is a senior political science and theology double major here at PC. He serves as a select man for North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and on the advisory board of Bristol County, and has served in both those capacities since 2014. He's also the vice president of the PC Debate Society. Nicole Cilio, who will be our moderator for today, is a junior biology major and enjoys debating health policy and ethical issues in healthcare. She is the secretary of the PC Debate Society and asked me in particular to mention that any of you who would like to join the Debate Society after today, which should be all of you in the room, please contact her as soon as possible after today. Welcome again, everyone. I'm going to turn the mic over to the Debate Society. Please enjoy the afternoon.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Is that working? Okay. Actually, Nicole is in charge, but I'm just going to explain how this works and what she'll do as soon as this gets going. This is a Cambridge Union style debate, and that usually works in the following way. You have two sides, and the sides debate a position in alternation, and after a number of rounds, in this case we'll just have two rounds, consisting of two 10-minute speeches each, right? So I'm going to make a proposal, then Dr. Meyers is going to come up and criticize my proposal and make a counter proposal. Then someone from my side, namely Patrick Reynolds, is going to continue my proposal, and then Noah Gemma, as the last speaker, is going to continue on the counter side. Sometimes people say government and opposition. It goes back to the British parliamentary style of debate. After those two rounds, the floor opens to the audience, which can actually participate in the debate by taking sides. You can also ask questions, but you can actually become part of the debate yourself by arguing one of the propositions, pro or contra. So we encourage you to engage in this debate. It should be fun. I'm really happy to be involved with the Providence College debate team because they're just great debaters and they're great students, and I'm really happy to have any opportunity to show them to the public. So I'm going to start. That kind of participation can happen as well. Yes, that can happen as well. No, please don't throw things. or if you do, try to aim well so that you don't hit any unintended persons. So
just to be clear, each speaker has 10 minutes. So when table once, just so you guys know kind of where we're at. And then when their timing is up, usually in a debate style, we would continue tapping the table to show that they're going over time. So just for that, that's why you know I'm tapping the table, not just because I'm getting rowdy or something like that. So you can be in whenever you would like.
Okay. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This House affirms the proposition that the majority should rule. And what we mean by this is that the majority rule is the right principle for determining the outcome of elections in a representative democracy. That the majority should rule is the proper principle of political legitimacy in a democracy. It determines who is authorized to rule in a political community in which no particular person or group of persons is legitimized to rule by family heritage or considerations of wealth. The wisdom of the founders and framers of modern democracies, including the US one, led them to impose constitutional constraints on what a majority may do when it is in power. Such constraints are contained in the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution, otherwise known as the Bill of Rights, which issues that no law may be passed which infringes on the establishment of religion or the freedom of speech, protects citizens from unreasonable search and seizure, and guarantees due process. Our foundational documents thus recognize certain protections of private rights which are inalienable and cannot be removed by just any political majority. It would require a political supermajority consisting of 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 2/3 of the state legislatures to change these items. There are thus strong constraints which protect minorities and individuals from abuses of their rights at the hands of a political majority. For the formation of a government, however, the constitution of a majority is unavoidable. To quote from John Locke, any community being only the consent of the individuals of it, and it being necessary to that which is one body to move one way, it is necessary the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority. That's the Second Treatise of Government, Article 96. Otherwise, it would be impossible for the body politic to act as one body or community. The consent to be a member of a community is consent to abide by the majority. Now, the principle of majority rule and any principle for deciding political contests will only be legitimate if it is compatible with our basic intuitions and beliefs about fairness and fair play. Majority rule is not just compatible with these, it follows from them. For our basic intuitions regarding fair play and fairness tell us that the winner of an electoral contest should be the person who accrues the most votes by those individuals who are enfranchised to vote. In a contest with only 2 candidates, this is simple to determine so long as there is no tie. In contests with more than 2 candidates, a system should be used which would ensure that a majority winner can be found. There are such systems of voting, for example, forms of ranked choice voting, but our purpose today will be to criticize one particular institution which can and often does violate the principle of majority rule and our basic intuitions of fairness. That is the US Electoral College for the election of President of the United States. Now, the Electoral College was designed to provide a mechanism by which electors, chosen in fact by the legislatures of the several states, would elect a president and vice president of the United States. The framers and founders thus accepted majority rule for the election of president, but not that of the average citizen. Only the majority of a specially elected body of electors was to decide. And of course, those electors, in turn, were to be determined by majority or plurality, plurality being the greatest number of votes minus 50%. Each state has as many votes as they do representatives to the Congress, that is, 2 senators plus however many representatives they have to the House. The member of representatives to the House is tied to the population of each state, which is determined every 10 years by a census. But this system, which was designed to weight representation by population, does not do what it was designed to do, and moreover, can and does violate the principle of majority rule. It fails to track population accurately because the population of each state fluctuates widely in the course of 10 years. This has the consequence that the census of 2010, for example, is still determining the distribution of representation in 2020 and even 2024 if the census results are not tabulated in time. And this is a clear inequity of the current system. But even more egregious is the fact that the national popular vote does not determine the winner of this particular contest. This is due to an efficiency gap between the number of votes it takes to win all the Electoral College votes of a single state and the number of votes required to gain a majority of the Electoral College votes all told. It can, and today indeed often does happen, that a candidate will win the majority of the popular vote, only to be denied the presidency if the surplus of votes in those states won by the candidate exceeds the number of votes cast for the candidate who won the Electoral College. This, in fact, can easily happen because less populous states are overrepresented in the current system by virtue of the fact that they all have 2 senators regardless of their population. Thus, for example, the senators from California represent approximately 36 million US citizens, whereas those from Wyoming represent 580,000 citizens. You would have to multiply the population of Wyoming 60 times to get the population of California. But California has 55 Electoral College votes, whereas Wyoming only has 3, a differential of 1 to 17. So under the current system, a vote for the president in California counts much less than it does in Wyoming, which violates basic standards of fair play and majority rule. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose that the Electoral College be abolished and the majority rule in US elections be introduced. Thank you very much.
Everybody hear me? Okay. So at the outset, let me say that I have no formal experience in Cambridge-style debating, so my style is probably going to be somewhat different from the styles of the other folks that are participating in this. Just letting everybody know in advance. Okay, so should majority rule? Well, I submit that before we decide that question, we need to think about how a system of majority rule is supposed to work, right? We need to think about how it's supposed to work before we can assess whether it works the way it's supposed to today, just as an empirical matter. And then we need to think about whether it actually can work the way it's supposed to. So I think most of us would agree that the way the majority rule is supposed to work runs something like what I'm about ready to say. So ordinary people, ordinary citizens, are supposed to have policy preferences. They are supposed to have thought about tax policy, about education policy, about trade policy, et cetera. And they're supposed to have come up with a view about what they, given what their values are, think the best policy should be. And then during election time, they're presented with parties that have different policy visions or candidates that have different policy visions, and they vote for the candidates who share their preference. Then the folks who get a majority of the vote win. They enact what the majority wants into law, and that way the majority gets what it wants. That is like a very kind of stylized, simple version of the way majority rule is supposed to work. And if it actually worked that way, I'd be in favor of it. But the problem is that we know, based on over 100 years of social science research, that that's not the way it works. And the problem is not with the politicians, which is where we usually like to place the problems in our society. The problem is actually with the voters themselves. As it turns out, we know, based on a ton of political science research and public opinion research, that ordinary voters do not have strong policy preferences. Most ordinary voters are ignorant about public policy, and they will admit it willingly in public opinion polls. More than that, most voters do not know where to place the parties on the issues. Political elites do. Politically sophisticated people do. But ordinary voters, for the most part, do not. And by the way, this is a finding that is consistent for countries all across the world. And it's consistent for all age brackets. I often meet students who say, oh, things are different from my generation. We're the internet generation. We have a lot more media. We know a lot more. Unfortunately, that is not true. Younger cohorts are just as ignorant as older cohorts. Now, in saying that voters are ignorant, I'm not saying they're stupid. I want to be very clear about this. The reality is that most voters are busy with their lives. They have to raise families. They have to feed. They have mouths to feed. They have limited spare time. They have to decide whether it makes sense to spend their limited spare time learning about public policy. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for most voters to conclude that it's not, given the fact that they are one of 320 million American citizens, right? And so the value that our society gets from them learning about public policy is quite small. Chances are their vote won't make a difference in an election. Chances are their voice won't be heard in congressional debates. And yet, 60% of Americans choose to vote. Now, usually when we think about turnout in American elections, the way that's framed is usually turnout is too low. What about the 40% that don't vote? We need to figure out ways to make them vote, right? But that can be flipped on its head. We can ask ourselves, if such a high percentage of voters don't know much about public policy, don't have clear views about policy issues, should they actually be voting, right? I'm not saying that's my position. I'm just saying that's a question that could be thrown out there. So if the 60% of voters, 60% of people who are eligible to vote and who vote are not voting based on public policy, what are they voting based off of? Well, there's a big, Scott study of voting behavior. It's a gigantic part of the political science discipline, and you can take a whole course on it. But to make a very, very long story short, basically, voters vote based on their social identities rather than their policy preferences. So what I mean by that is, well, I'll ask a question to kind of get at what I mean by that. If you were given if you were asked to predict what a random American, or how a random American voted in the last presidential election, would you rather know their views on trade policy, their views on education policy, their views on criminal justice policy, et cetera? Or would you rather know their race, their gender, their level of religiosity or their religion, and their geographical location? As somebody who has studied voting behavior and used to work as a pollster, I can tell you I would much rather know their demographic characteristics, because those are much more predictive of the way people vote than their policy views. And the reason for this is really quite simple. While it's true that ordinary voters don't understand public policy very well, it turns out they do understand something very kind of intuitive about the way politics work in a mass democracy like ours. They do understand that politics does generally boil down to competition between social groups, competition between racial groups, competition between religious groups, competition between income groups, competition between geographical groups, et cetera, right? And so they vote for the parties or for the candidates that they perceive as being on their team, right? The thought process of most voters isn't which politician shares my policy views. It's rather which politician is on my team, which politician will represent my group. And there's a couple of big consequences to this. One of them is that politicians or voters can't hold politicians accountable, right? Because they don't know anything about public policy, right? So they can't hold politicians accountable for their policy decisions. Another one is the politicians, because politicians intuitively grasp, right? Whether or not they're able to say with the same level of, sophistication that I'm doing right now, that voters vote based on their social identities or not based on their public policy, whether or not they're able to say that, they're able to intuitively grasp the concept. And that's why they understand that in order to maintain their constituencies, in order to build their constituencies, what they really need to do is further divide and inflame people, further exacerbate social divisions, because it's those social divisions that have put them into office in the first place. Now, everything I've said up until this point, right, is what basically the discipline of political science has found over the past 100 years. That means 3 minutes, right? Okay. But the truth is, we didn't really need 100 years of social science research to know this. I mean, political science has given kind of the study of voting behavior a level of sophistication that it didn't have before, but the American founders understood much of what I said very well 250 years ago, long before social science came about. So let me quote James Madison from Federalist 10. one of the chief writers of our Constitution. A zeal for different opinion regarding religion, concerning government, and attachment to different leaders, ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their most unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. So this gets at everything I said before, the tendency of people to form groups, to think about social and political life in terms of us versus them, and to be guided by emotion rather than reason. The founders of the United States understood this. They didn't want to get rid of democracy completely, but they wanted to create a government that was ultimately responsive to popular opinion, but also insulated from it, right? That's why they created the Electoral College. The Electoral College was supposed to be an institution that was ultimately responsive to the people, but insulated from it via the creation of several layers between the people and the President of the United States. That's why they made the US Senate indirectly elected by the people too. That's why they gave members of Congress from the House and Senate different lengths of office. The founders wanted public opinion to be taken into account, but they wanted to put the brakes on it, right? They wanted to create a forum in the federal government that would lead to deliberation. And so they weren't entirely opposed to the majority rule, but they wanted it tempered. And that's what we, on our side, are advocating for. A political system that takes into account popular opinion, but has certain institutional mechanisms to filter it, to temper it. Some of the things that the founders may have come up with to temper public opinion, like, for example, 6-year terms for the Senate, may no longer make much sense, right? These days, the Senate isn't insulated from public opinion as much as it used to be because of mass media and other features of our modern society. But I want to suggest that we need to rethink about how to create a deliberative public body, a deliberative policy-making body. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for being here today. We've had an overview on whether or not you should have majority rule, and now we're going to try to bring it to a more concrete example by talking specifically about the Electoral College. So to sort of start with an overview of why the Electoral College was created by the framers in the first place, we go back to 1787 when this idea was being discussed, and there were a couple reasons why it was chosen. The first one being a concern about the lack of political parties and coordinating institutions that could spread information about presidential candidates. I think as you can see today, that's no longer a problem. Very soon after the Electoral College was started, which as Dr. Meyers said, was partially to lead to not having factions in our government, actually led to lots of factions and led to political parties which have continued till today. We have a news media that goes 24/7, social media. There's so many more opportunities for people across this wide nation to hear about the candidates. And there's no longer a need for a model like the Electoral College to give us that information. The other problem would be that there's no technological ability to have people vote nationwide in the same day, simultaneously across the country. Today our country is much bigger, but our technology has advanced so that now you have the ability to do that. You can vote anywhere in the country for who you want to win American Idol. I think the technology probably exists to do the exact same thing for President of the United States. Another reason is that states had very different rules on who was allowed to vote. This is not so true today, as we've had Supreme Court decisions, constitutional amendments that have made a more universal standard for enfranchisement, although differences do exist today. And in fact, having a system like the Electoral College gives a perverse incentive to lower enfranchisement. If you had a national election, majority rule election, every state would have an incentive to increase enfranchisement as much as they could. And the final reason why this was created was slavery. At the time, the southern states didn't want to have majority rule because slaves were not allowed to vote. They would lose on a lot of voters. But by having a system like the Electoral College, where population is taken into account, with a 3/5 compromise, they would have 3/5 of their slave population counted, but they couldn't vote. So in reality, what happened was southern voters had more of a say than northern voters. And even after slavery ended, this perverse advantage didn't end, it actually increased. If you fast forward to the Jim Crow era in the South, now black voters were counting as the full 5/5, but yet they still couldn't vote, which just gave white Southerners even more power in this perverse system with perverse incentives for states. Since that time, the arc of history has been decidedly pro-majoritarian. During the progressive era in the early 20th century, primaries for political parties became open, where voters actually got to choose who their candidate was going to be. Senators were no longer elected by state legislatures, but elected by the people. The public began to have the ability to have ballot initiatives, recall elected officials. So why, with everything else changing to this majoritarian framework, is the United States, the government founded on the words, "we the people," the only Western democracy that indirectly elects a leader who is both head of state and head of government? On our side, we think it's about time that this process changed. We see many problems with the system of Electoral College. I think Dr. King covered a lot of them, which is this difference between population and actually voting. How states, like the big example here is Wyoming and California, how there's such a big difference in population compared to electoral votes. If you're in a smaller state, your vote counts mathematically much more than it counts in a larger state. And in the practice of it today, if you live in a swing state, if you live in Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida, your vote counts much more, and you get much more attention than it would if you lived in a solidly blue or a solidly red state. We think even beyond that, there's further problems, such as the ability to have a tie. It could be a scenario where there could be a tie in the Electoral College, whereas that is almost mathematically impossible when you have a national popular vote. And furthermore, if there is a tie, the president is then elected by Congress. Congress, which is the most disliked and distrusted institution in the United States of America. Congress, which polls lower than Nickelback, traffic jams, cockroaches, and root canals. That's the institution that we're going to have picking the most powerful person on the face of the planet. So we think instead the decision should be turned over to the people. And so to get into that argument, I want to turn to some of the things that the opposite side has said and Dr. Meyers has very eloquently said. So the beginning is, how should a system of majority rule? I think we sort of agree with his framework that ordinary citizens should be able to make policy decisions, and then elected officials should be able to put that into action. But he claims that this does not work in our current system. So I think I would agree in the Electoral College system it doesn't work, and that it would work if we had a majoritarian national election. So to begin with that argument, we'll look first to Federalist Papers 10 by James Madison. The supporter of the Electoral College, and his argument was actually in favor of the Electoral College. But I think today we can apply it to why the Electoral College is now out of date. So Madison argues that the bigger your republic is, the better they're going to be at making decisions. That's why he advocates for a large Electoral College, because you're more likely to have better decisions, more people involved. But of course, as I described earlier, there were certain things, technological challenges, differences in states, that made it impossible for Madison to get behind a national election. But now that those constraints are outdated and no longer apply, we can use Madison's own logic to say that the bigger the republic, the bigger the voting pool, the better decisions we're going to make. And that's why having a national election is better than leaving the decision in the hands of a few in the Electoral College, who, as we mentioned before, aren't even properly allocated by population. So I think underneath this, Dr. Meyers makes some statements about individuals' abilities to have policy preferences. And I think what's important is that elections aren't about policy preferences. Elections are about values. If it was all about policy preferences, we could just have computer models and polls and algorithms to figure out what the government should do, how to figure out which program is more efficient if A is more efficient than B, or vice versa. But the reason we have elections is because elections are about values. It's about the unresolvable differences in values that we have as a community. There are just some issues where we have differences of opinion on value, on what is the right outcome, and they can never be resolved. And that's why the majority must make a decision. We have what philosopher Thomas Nagel calls fragmentation of values, and only the people can adequately decide which value is the majority value. I think we also recognize that demographics take a role in that. I think it's true that demographics will be a good indicator of how someone voted in the last election. But that's because demographics often influence and have an effect on our values. Let's look at an issue like abortion. You can't just decide which is a better policy position. It all becomes down to your values. Are you valuing privacy rights? Are you valuing sort of more religious rights? And your demographics lead into that. If you're a more religious person or a less religious person, that's probably going to change what your values are, which you think is the better outcome. Look at tax rates. Based on your demographics, based on your income, based on your life experiences, you're probably going to favor equality of tax rates versus equality of incomes in a society. So it's a value question that only the people can decide. I think also we should probably expand what our definition of policy preference and policy knowledge is. Sure, every American's not an expert on advanced systems of government or economics, but they're an expert on their own life. And I think that is a policy decision. If we want to talk about farming, every American isn't an expert on international trade laws with farming, but they know their own community. That farmer in Iowa is a policy expert on what it's like to be a farmer in Iowa. That cattle herder in Montana is an expert on what it's like to be a cattle herder in Montana. And I think the beauty of a majoritarian system is that we have the widest set of knowledge. I think when you want knowledge, you want the widest set, the most diverse set. By having the entire country, millions and millions of people partaking in this program, in this process, we have the widest set of knowledge we possibly could. And as Madison said, we should be expanding the pool of who can partake in this election. I think it's also been mentioned that there will be further divisions in social groups, but we think, in fact, the opposite is going to take place. We think that the larger your voting pool is, the more moderate positions are going to have to take place. Look at the presidential elections. The positions that are stated in primaries are always far more extreme than the positions that are stated in general elections. Why? Because in general elections, candidates are forced to appeal to the largest group of people. The larger that group, the more moderate their positions are going to have to be, and the more, because they're going to have to win parts of different groups. So they can't just appeal to one group. Their views actually have to become larger. And finally, I think a big question of this is how much insulation the people should have from the government. I think that's a pretty big contention from the other side, that there should be more insulation between the government and the people. So we think that firstly, throughout time, this insulation has gone down. Like we mentioned before, senators were once not elected by the people. Now they are. The people have the ability to enact legislation through ballot referendums, recall elected officials. This insulation has gone down and down. We think this is a good thing. We think, first of all, insulation already exists. Bureaucrats are those that aggregate the values the election puts forward and the actual policies that take place. These unelected people are the ones that take the values presented by voters and make it into policy preferences. So the people don't necessarily have to do that themselves. We think there are also already institutions in our American government that are very insulated from the public, and it's usually not a good thing. What kind of institutions come to mind? The CIA, the NSA? They usually go past having government regulation by the public, and it usually doesn't end very well. That's why they do things in foreign countries, break laws, do things they probably shouldn't. And if there was more oversight by the people and less insulation, these would be less likely to take place. We think, if you look at the problems of our current political system, the answer isn't more divide between the governed and the government, it's less. We think we should have things like gerrymandering, things like money in politics create a bigger and bigger divide between the public and the government, and we should be doing the opposite if we want to fix our political system. Thank you.
So the first half of Patrick's speech relies on one principle, and by attacking that one principle, I think I can refute about half his speech. So that principle is this: if the reason for creating something no longer exists, then that thing should not exist. I think that's an obvious fallacy. He uses it for the first half of his speech. By analogy, by applying that principle, you'd say something like a university should not exist. Universities were created to specialize in theology. Most universities no longer specialize in just theology. So by that principle that he uses throughout the first half of his speech, universities should no longer exist. Then there's one more big problem that was just embedded throughout his speech, and that was that people say Congress is bad, therefore people should vote. But it kind of begs the question. The first half of it relies on the intuitions of the people, and then he uses intuitions of the people to justify the intuitions of the people. So there are two features of the Electoral College that proponents of majority rules will have to defend. The first is that the state population does not correlate with the state vote amount. And the second is that the electors vote and not the population. I will spend my speech defending the second one of those. So I'm defending that the people vote on the state legislators who vote for the electors who vote for the president. So the two buffer layers, which goes against the principles of majority rules. There are 3 points that I think work on my side here. And the first one is it will create better presidents. So there are two parts of an election. The first part is how the candidate appeals to the voters. So I'm going to divide this one part into two further parts, the side of the majority and the side of the electors and not the majority. So when a candidate is running for office and is appealing to majority, he'll typically do something along the following lines. One thing is he'll revert to appealing to people's anger. Aristotle in the Rhetoric talks about how this is the primary factor or persuasion tactic for stirring up people, calling them to action. Humor doesn't work so well, but when you talk about anger, talking about taking away something from people, that will call them to action. An example of it would look something like this. Do you work hard for your money? You probably say yes. What if I told you that there were people who were paid to take away your money? That's called the government. You'd be like, wow, that's really wrong. I want to do something about it. I stirred you up by anger, even by letting you know beforehand that that's what stirs people up. So what else will go on in the popular vote? It will be simple because you'll be appealing to people who do not have a shared wealth of economic or political knowledge. So you'll need to kind of present knowledge that will apply to everyone. So it'll be very simple. It won't be substantive. And as Professor Meyers rightly pointed out, it will revert to identity politics, and you'll be appealing to people who have no education in the matters. But what if you're running and you're appealing to the specialized electors, people who did have specialized knowledge in economics, politics, and philosophy? How would that look? Well, for one thing, it would be more substantive. And you're not appealing to a wide mass of people, you're appealing to a special few, so you can't use the tactic of anger to stir them up. And then another principle is that this is a theological principle, but I think I can kind of make it work here. Whatever is received from the motive of the receiver. So basically that the electors have specialized knowledge, and they're going to use the specialized knowledge to sort through the information that's presented to them. Their education will function as a filter and an organizer of the content presented to them. So I think that when you have the candidate running, he'll be presenting more substantive information, more pertinent information to his position as president than he would when he was presenting the information to the popular vote and not the specialized electors. And the second part of the election is how do voters evaluate a candidate? On the popular side, people will evaluate poorly because they will have received poor information. I think the information I gave you earlier applies to this part. And most people lack the proper tools and education. Now, on the elector side, they will be able to evaluate the information better. They'll have more expertise. There's an obvious correlation between education/experience and knowledge. This is something we can all attest to. We don't want kids to vote because kids don't have this special knowledge. And also, when you're sick, you want to see the doctor. You look for his specialized knowledge. When you're sailing, you want to seek the information of the captain. You want his specialized knowledge because that's what he's trained in and that's what he has experience in. And And you might thought when I gave the sailing example, what about like the crewman? The crewman should be able to stand up to the captain and say, no, you're doing something wrong. But if you thought that as a response to what I've said, you've misunderstood it and you'd probably side with me. The crewman does have specialized training, has specialized knowledge, so that would be a disanalogous. A better analogy would be like you are sailing, you should listen to the captain because you don't have that specialized knowledge. So how will these two factors of the election relate to the presidents? On the popular vote side, you'll have a president who is elected and will have never demonstrated actual knowledge because that's not the best way to win the popular vote. And you can have a president who won by stirring up the masses with anger because that's one of the best rhetorical tactics, as Aristotle pointed out. But if you appeal to an electors, what would the president look like? The president will actually have the relevant knowledge to rule, and the president will have spent his campaign time studying up on policies and presenting those policies to the electors. So that's the first benefit of the side of the Electoral College as opposed to the majority rules. So that's more of the quality. Now I'm going to go deeper into the philosophy point. So I'll call this point B, and I'll call this, it gives the people what they really want. So on their side, even if you buy that my side has the better quality official, you might think they have the side of political legitimacy. I'm going to respond to that here. So all people and all their actions, they're aiming for fulfillment, they're aiming for happiness. That's their furthest good that they're aiming for. And all the closer decisions they make on day to day, they think that will bring them fulfillment or happiness. Now, if you have a president who, let's say, doesn't understand economic theory, he won't be able to put people in good positions to achieve the fulfillment, which is what they really want. But if you did elect a president who does understand things like economic theory, he can put them in positions to achieve their fulfillment. I'm just going to capitalize this point. It's going to take a principle from Aquinas, then it's going to just apply this principle here. So Aquinas says, when people they act, they know that they should do good and avoid evil. So what you get from this is a statement. You should do what is good. What is good is what fulfills your nature. So you should do what fulfills your nature. But the problem here is that the government also has a competing should statement. You should do what the law says to do. I think the former claim, you should do what is good, you should do what fulfills your nature, overrides the claim, you should do what the law says to do when they conflict. So because the first one is more important, that's like the primary principle we act upon when living our lives, I think it is important that we do have a quality government that doesn't make us kind of go against that first principle, which is more important. A government that puts us in a position where we can do what is good without contradicting the laws of the government. And I think that's where you get the justification for the Electoral College, because on our side we have higher quality presidents that make higher quality rules and put these people in these good positions. Now I'm just going to touch upon one more point. On our side, we don't have the problem of the majority of oppressing the minority. They tried to kind of squirrel their way out of this earlier in the round when they said that there are constitutional constraints and things like that. But there are a lot of ways to oppress people while following the rules of the Constitution. The Constitution just has 10 points, I think he said. So if you can find a way to oppress people while adhering to those 10 points, you can still allow for the majority to oppress the minority. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, we just want to thank the speakers for their eloquent remarks on both sides. I think we should give them a round of applause. They did a really good job. So now we're going to kind of open up the floor for you guys to ask some questions. Maybe if you want to raise a point that maybe you were thinking when they were speaking, we'd love to have some participation, especially from students. If you're on the debate team, I know you have some ideas in there. So does anyone want to ask the first question or raise the first point? Sure. Yeah, go ahead, stand up. Say it, make it stand.
This is a question for Pat. You stated at one point that the statements by people running for, say, president, for example, in the primaries are much more radical or extreme than they would be in the generals. So how do you ensure that when someone makes a radical statement in the primary and gets a lot of votes in that sector, and then tries to generalize their statement to reach a broader audience, how do you make sure that they're not just going to go back on the broader statements and go back to their more radical statements? And in terms what I'm saying is, like, they could say they want this and then just go back on it once they're elected.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, certainly the idea that politicians will lie to us and do something different than they say is going to happen always in any society, any system. I think specifically what makes the majoritarian system different is that they're accountable. If they've been elected in that system, they've been elected by the majority, they're now accountable to the majority. So that means the majority is going to elect people to Congress that are going to go and try to stop what they're doing. That means they're not going to win next time around. If they have a system like the Electoral College or some other system where you have that divide between the governed and the government, there's no accountability. That elected official can completely renege on everything they say, and it's not going to matter. As much as if you have a majority system where they're absolutely going to be held accountable, because there's more people, they're accountable to more people, basically, because everyone has a piece of the process. They're all involved in some way.
Does anything?
So this is primarily for the anti-majoritarian side, but if you guys want to chime in, you can. You talked primarily about justifications for the Electoral College and reasons that it would be a good thing, that it subvert the will of the majority. Fortunately, we have several concrete examples of that actually happening in US history, one being the most recent presidential election. So would you say that that is an example of the benefits of the Electoral College, or would you say that this is an example where the will of the majority was actually more aligned with what you might call policy sophistication? Did the Electoral College, I guess, do the job that it was intended to do according to your definition? Do you want to take that?
When I was defending the Electoral College, I wasn't defending how it was used now, but like you said, how it was intended to be used. I don't think how it is used now is how it was intended to be used.
This is to all of the speakers. This is to all of the speakers. Whether the majority rules presupposes we have an answer to the question, a majority of what? And in contemporary America, secessionist rhetoric abounds. The most recent one, perhaps the most spectacular one, is the slogan, "Not my president." This goes beyond the claim of some opponents of Obama that he was not the president on ridiculous grounds, but that doesn't matter. Large numbers of individuals have claimed the right, how seriously I would not care to say, to veto the election. Not because Clinton got the majority of the popular vote, but because they just jolly well don't like the winner for some reasonable grounds. Once this kind of issue is raised, we're rather beyond quibbling about the Electoral College.
That's exactly why we should have a truly majoritarian system. Because if you have a majoritarian system, then the majority, or at least a plurality of people, did actually go into a voting booth and vote for that person. So the majority of people are still going to respect that person. And I think, as something Dr. King said earlier when quoting the second treatise, is that the opinion of the majority is the body moving as one. And so obviously everyone's not always going to agree with that and not always going to move. They're going to be kind of forced to move as the body moves. But at least you have some mechanism of the whole body moving, and presumably the vast majority of people moving with it, whether or not they really want to. Whereas if you have that division with an electoral college system, that's not as much the case. People have less invested in it. They don't say, oh, I went to the polls and I voted, my vote really counted. I wasn't the majority, my vote really mattered. Now they're saying this group in Washington or this group elected by state legislators or however it's done has made a decision for me. I'm not invested in that decision. I wasn't truly consulted, so I don't really have to respect it. I think you have more of you're forced more to respect it when you've taken part in that decision.
do you really believe the pink pussy hat people would have changed their views if Trump had got a majority of the popular vote?
I think there's always going to be divisions, certainly. I think that's, again, about why I think the majoritarian system is better, is it soothes over some of those divisions and that everyone is forced to appeal to everyone at the same time. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump would have been forced to appeal to all the groups as opposed to just specific groups in specific states. They've been forced to make an argument to everyone and theoretically be more palatable to everyone. Not everyone's going to agree, certainly, but I think a higher amount of people would have agreed.
I think that actually shows a strong point on our side. You don't see people doing that when Justice Gorsuch was nominated to the Supreme Court because they didn't vote on that.
So I'm actually interested in this foundational question, and I think this was a really good question, because if you're saying that the Electoral College is a benefit because it will protect us from an ignorant demagogue, right? It did not, right? So I mean, truly, right? I mean, there's objectively, the person who won does not read or know anything about policy. And so, you know, the Electoral College now is just bonus votes. And so if it's bonus votes, I think that it might be useful thinking about where the bonus votes come from. And Patrick made this point, and I think it's important, the bonus points come from giving a bonus to the slaveholders. You know? I mean, that is a foundational problem. And then the Senate, oh, the Senate is anti-democratic. And it not only is it anti-democratic, the Senate, representation in the Senate is unchangeable in the Constitution. In Article 5. Article 5, which is already makes it an impossibility to get an amendment through with a 2/3 and then 3/4 requirement for ratification. In Article 5, it says the Senate, you can't lose an equal representation in the Senate unless you have 100% agreement. Everyone must agree to give up their senators if you want to change representation in the Senate. So that's an impossibility. I mean, I would never advise, now as someone who is a resident of Rhode Island, I'm all for the Senate, right? But I don't want to talk too long, but I just want to, this idea of equal protection, right? In the 1960s, the Supreme Court says state senates cannot be based on geography because that denies equal protection. And they said that was okay in the US Senate because they had to do that in order to bring everyone in to agree, right? It was a kind of foundational thing. So, I mean, I guess my question is, based on these conditions that no longer exist, we have senators from states where people don't, states do not operate in the way that states once operated. And we have an electoral college based on favors to slaveholders. And now we maintain the electoral college that doesn't operate as a check on demagogues. It just gives bonus points to states with fewer people. So my question is, how do we defend those things? Sorry, that was too long.
Okay, so you threw out a lot there. So let me see if I can take it piece by piece, and Noah, if you have anything you'd like to say, you can speak after me. So first of all, we need to clarify something that perhaps wasn't made clear. We're defending the Electoral College the way it was originally envisioned, right? We're not defending the way it works today. Today, essentially, the Electoral College amounts to 51 presidential elections, right? And each of those presidential elections results in a certain number of electoral votes, and whoever gets the most electoral votes wins. That's not the way the Electoral College was envisioned by the founders, right? The Electoral College, under the vision of the founders, each state was awarded electoral votes in accordance to its number of representatives and senators. And state legislatures got to choose how those electoral votes would be awarded, and the founders assumed that the state legislatures would choose the members of the Electoral College itself, right? So there was supposed to be two barriers in between the people and the president, right? The people were to elect the state legislatures, who would then elect the Electoral College, who would then elect the president. The reason the founders wanted to create those barriers was precisely because they wanted to prevent a demagogue from being elected president. The purpose of the Electoral College is to prevent demagogues from being president, to prevent people who are patently unfit to hold the office, who just kind of whip ordinary people up into a frenzy, right? By kind of, you know, tweeting and just sort of activating their emotions, right? That was the original purpose of the Electoral College, and so we're not defending the way it works today. You're right. Today it works essentially, basically what it is it's an affirmative action program for small states, right? And we're not in favor of that. Now I'm forgetting the rest of what you asked. Oh, right. So again, the Senate also doesn't work the way it was originally designed to work. The Senate originally was supposed to be indirectly elected by the people. The people would elect the state legislatures. The state legislatures would select the senators. That was also a mechanism that the founders thought up to create a certain amount of insulation between the people in the federal government, or the elected officials in the federal government, and ordinary people, right? The founders, their vision for the federal government was one in which one chamber of the Congress, the House of Representatives, there'd be a direct relationship between the people and the folks that were serving in the House of Representatives, right? The Senate would be indirectly elected, would serve longer terms, and so it would be a more deliberative body. And the president would be further removed from the people, right? Because these two layers would exist between the president and the people. Obviously today, much of this is reversed, right? Today, actually, the president has become kind of a publicitary institution. It's become an institution with a direct relation to the people, you know? These days, we kind of think of the president as being the people's primary spokesperson in government. But what we're arguing for is sort of a reacquaintance with the original founding vision, right? Which was really an effort to create a more deliberative governing body in the national government.
One thing on that? Just one thing to your comment. There was one thing that that Madison in particular just got wrong, which is they thought that there were going to be like 5 candidates for president, and that they would constantly be dealing with this kind of unmanageable number of contenders. Well, because of our two-party system, which is basically an aberration, there's no Western democracy which only has 2 parties. It's a result of our voting system, of course, the first past the post voting system, and the entrenchment of the 2 parties that we have. You cannot generate more possibilities, and so I think that actually increases the danger of a demagogue and adds to the difficult situation that you have currently. If we had a ranked choice voting system, or, I mean, not even changing to a parliamentary system where the parliament elects the government, just a ranked choice voting system where you could rank your choices, I think that already would create big disincentives for the kind of socially divisive campaigning that Adam very accurately described.
I'm just going to follow up on that question a little bit, because the statement that you reminded us of is that you guys are defending the Electoral College as it ought to be, right? And the question is, if the Electoral College ought to be one way, it was designed to be one way and it's not, and the Senate was supposed to be one way and it's not, and we have seen historically that governmental systems are supposed to be one way and they're not, can we actually defend something as it ought to be as a legitimate option? Because we hardly ever get to what it ought to be.
I can say something to how it could be reformed. There's, well, let the majority rule. Well, there's actually a campaign underway by an organization called Fair Vote to introduce a national popular vote, and they're doing this by a state-by-state compact. And they're having the states pledge that they will give their electors to whichever candidate wins the national popular vote. Currently, this compact, I think, is at around 23 states or so. They're just shy of half the states that they need, but they actually, what they really need is a majority of Electoral College votes. So if they get enough states to sign on to this, to actually get the majority of Electoral College votes, that will, in practice, if not in principle, create a national popular vote for president. And that could work, and it's a nice workaround because it's not a change of the Constitution, which, as we know, is very difficult.
Okay, so in regards to your very, astute question about whether or not whether we're defending an institution the way it ought to work versus the way it actually does work. Well, first of all, to some extent, you're right. But remember, that the premise that we're actually debating in this debate is not the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an example of a structure that relates to the general principle that we're debating. The general principle that we're debating is, should majority rule? And what I started off arguing was that majority rule does not work the way it ought to work, right? Majority rule starts off with the notion that people have policy preferences, and I'm telling you guys, based on 100 years of social science research, they don't. So that's the first point. The second point I would make, I wanted to actually say something in response to Phil's comment. Okay. So you were talking about how, a whole percentage of the population, a large percentage of the population doesn't accept the legitimacy of the current president, and you were saying that would be true whether Trump won the popular vote or not. But again, let me remind you of the central point that I originally made, right, which I think very, very accurately reflects on the 2016 election. I said people vote based on their social identities and their partisan loyalties, not based on public policy. 2016 campaign was remarkably devoid of policy debates. It was all about what Noah correctly called identity politics, right? Trump, our current president, he essentially, moved up to the top of the Republican field by trying to divide people, by engaging in this very divisive demagogic rhetoric, right? And that worked in galvanizing certain people to become part of his base, and it also worked in repulsing and alienating other people who felt attacked by him. So the way in which the 2016 campaign worked, I think, basically comports with what I'm saying, right? That majority rule in a mass democracy leads to social division. It leads to this construction of us versus them, which is fundamentally unhealthy. In regards to your question, which is a great question, what we're advocating for is that we need to return to the founding principles that this country was based upon, right? A government which is responsive to public opinion, but which is also insulated from public opinion, so that we can have a deliberative decision-making forum, right? So some things that might involve would be a return to the indirect election of senators, a return to the Electoral College the way it was supposed to work, and maybe a variety of other new things that we can think of to insulate government from public pressure.
I have a second. Are you
It depends on the question.
Oh, okay. Oh, no. I have a second question. You've spoken widely against identity politics, and I know you're saying that people aren't really aware of public policy. However, people's identities very inherently affect public policy. So an immigrant family would be against the wall. Somebody... like your personal experience does affect it, and I know the majority side was saying that, but how can you argue the fact that if you're unemployed and you can't get health care, those demographics do affect your opinion on those public policies? So you're saying this is a good policy because it will help me get health care, it will help my family come into this country, X, Y, and Z, all of these things. How can you deny that the demographics you're saying, those are the entire determinants, but those are the people. And those are what affects politics.
I think there are a few ways to respond. Firstly, what you're showing that is people are voting on their immediate self-interest. I don't think that's good. Because someone has a certain health care issue, that doesn't mean the one that they vote for will be best for the common good. But more importantly, they're just voting on, they have a narrow vision. That person's voting on just health care. There's a lot more to consider than that one issue that they won't take into account.
Dude, I don't really need this. So originally, I was going to ask it as two questions, and I thought it was one question, and now I forgot the. Right. Use it? All right, I got it. So, yeah, I'm glad. So, my general question was going to be the question that's put on the flyer is should majorities rule. The question that was mostly debated is should we have an electoral college, which seems to me like a radically different question, maybe tangentially related. One, if you equate those, then by majority rule, you don't mean rule, you mean should majorities elect, and you don't mean elect, you mean should they elect a specific person, namely the President for the United States, which is one relatively small, we focus on it a lot, but it's a relatively small part of the government. So you reiterated that the actual question is whether or not majority should rule, and so then my unified question, my sub-question was going to be about what the majoritarian side actually means by majority. Because from the majoritarian side, the vast majority of what I heard was majorities should rule because, well, look, in the Electoral College, majorities don't rule, and that's bad, right? Which is assuming that majority rule is good. But there's been really no address of why majority rule should be good. One, by majority, when we use majority in common language, what we mean by that is a vast majority, right? That's just what, like a normal person, they said, hey, a bunch of friends are going out, a majority of them want to go to this place. We don't mean 50.001% of the people want to go to this place, right? Nobody would really consider that to be a majority, but in fact, in the last several presidential elections, it almost comes down to that. So by majority, you mean just over 50%, which if anything's a tyranny of a majority, that seems pretty egregiously so. So when you talk, I forgot the student's name, pro-majoritarian student, Patrick. So you, as far as I could tell, the one time when it was directly addressed is you appealed to this principle that the larger an institution or a republic is, the wiser the decisions that they make. You kept appealing to that principle, which seems manifestly false to me. I mean, it seems equivalent to saying the best symphony will be the one that has the most notes in it, right? Which will just be a wall of noise, right? And you appealed to the specific knowledge of the individual farmers, which, yes, is relevant to their specific knowledge as in being an individual farmer. But if you're talking about majority rule and making an overall single winner-take-all, all-or-nothing decision between two binary options, and by majority you mean something that is a mathematical majority that can be 50.001%, so leaving the Electoral College out of it and addressing the actual question on the flyer, why, what are the advantages of majority rule, is my question.
I'll let Patrick answer for himself in just a moment, but just to the point of how we set this up, it's obviously useful for illustrating a principle to take an example. So we took an example, and by majority, of course, in an election, in a modern election, you can only mean 50% plus X. Any other qualification of majority would be a supermajority. There are such qualifications, for example, for certain procedures in the Senate, right? Now we have the filibuster, right, which is trying to explode the supermajority, but a majority obviously does mean 50% plus X. Now that's not a trivial thesis at all. As a matter of fact, it's a hallmark of modern democracy to introduce majoritarian principles. For example, in early modern Enlightenment France, people were very worried that majority decisions rendered by juries would not be reliable. So a mathematician named Condorcet came up with a theorem to say exactly what you're denying, and it's actually mathematically true, and it cannot be disproven, that if you assume that a decider has a 50% plus X percent of being right about a certain binary decision, like say guilty or not guilty, and you increase the size of the jury constituted of such deciders, then the likelihood of this jury rendering a correct decision is directly proportional to the increase in the number of jury members. So this has nothing to do with the compositional fallacy of, say, the best symphony is the one with most notes. That's obviously absurd. It's also disanalogous. This has to do with the idea that if you increase the base of deciders, and those deciders are tendentially right, and that's an epistemological optimism about deciders that we could discuss, but that is at issue here, right? This is what we inherited from the Enlightenment, was this epistemological optimism that people generally know the truth, right? That would be the thing to contest, not the idea that a large basis of people is unreliable. That seems to be, as it were, common doctrine in the Enlightenment, and we're dealing with the institutions that we inherited from the Enlightenment. So that has that deeper history of philosophy background. There, of course, is the further philosophical debate about whether government should be somehow impartial or whether government should represent the stakes that people have in certain things. And that comes out also with your very good question about why can't my policy preference just be informed by what my interest is, right? To say that there's the common good and that we should all just care about the common good, just to appeal to the common good, is not going to solve the issue, because the common good itself is part of the contentious concept that is being required here. So the idea that Patrick brought up, I think, is that everybody is their own expert about their life experience. That is, they are the best knowers about the things that affect them directly. And given that policies affect them directly, then we really do have a community of good knowers, and increasing that group, the number in that community, directly increases the reliability of the decisions thus made.
Yeah, I would just say on that too, I think that in a way, both sides accept majorities as a way to make decisions. The question is, which majority you want to use. I think on their side, it's a majority, but it's a majority of the minority. It's a majority of a very select elite group of people, whereas we want the majority to be as big as possible, to include everyone who's enfranchised, to include all those who are stakeholders in the community, those that will be impacted by its decisions. Although as a tool, both are using majority to make a decision, because ultimately, somehow mathematically, you have to come to a decision. I think, as we mentioned, it's sort of as a counterpoint to their idea that you can have this small group of people that will just have such knowledge, they'll be able to make the best decision. I don't think that having a small elite group of people is necessarily going to lead to more knowledge. Like we said, I think we have a wider breadth of knowledge, a more diverse group of knowledge by including the most amount of people possible. And I think, too, a big point is that elections are all about values and deciding what the values of community are, because there's a big unresolvable difference, like we were talking about the group of people who would support Clinton versus Trump, and to a certain extent, those social groups have differences of values which really can't be resolved. And so I think having the majority rule is the best way to aggregate those differences and pick what are the values that our politicians and our bureaucrats, who are insulated somewhat, are then going to translate into policy decisions.
I just want to raise a quick question about it, because I don't know if everyone up here is for the majoritarian, like wanted to rule by majority. Why did I say that? So clearly the majority guys are going for democracy. I can get a sense from that, and I think that leads, why Trump really? Well, Aristotle, I think, points out that democracies naturally lead to a demagogue appearing at some point, because the democracy is the best of the worst forms of government. Like, people remember, like, oh, it's the best form of government of all the ones we have. Churchill said that. He didn't mean that, though. He meant it was the best of the worst forms, because democracy is the rule of the many for their own self-interest. Right? Okay, so it's better than oligarchies and tyrannies. Okay, but you're going to get a tyranny from a democracy anyway with the demagogue. But here's the trick, right? So I think the question is, on the other side, though, Noah Eloquent pointed out that it's good to have buffers and people ruling for the good, right? So people that are ruling, and you could say the few who are ruling for the good, whether that might be expert knowledge or the common good or whatever you want to talk about it. So not the values of the many, which could be problematic, but the good, you know? Aristotle doesn't call that a democracy, he calls that an aristocracy. And the other part is, and he doesn't have, this is a really interesting thing about the Book of Politics, is he doesn't have a name for the rule of the many for the good. It's he just calls it what politics is. But he doesn't give a name for it. We call it a republic or a representational democracy or some constitutional government if you read the Lambert, the Loeb edition. But it's actually not in there in the Greek. It's not. He doesn't have a name for it because it might not exist. But that's also the general name of a citizen. He calls it the general form of government, but it doesn't use the specific name of a regime. Now, you could make a debate about whether he thinks it exists or not. But my question to the anti-majority side is your position an aristocracy? And if not, why isn't it? Why is it a democracy?
Can you define aristocracy one more time?
I'll just use Aristotle's. Aristocracy is ruled by the few for the good of the society.
That sounds. I think that has a lot of negative connotations, the word aristocracy, but I'm fine with that definition.
So aristocracy the good is for the virtue, right? Aristocrat is someone who rules for virtue, for the good. And I'm not saying that aristocracy is bad. I think it's actually okay.
I'm fine with that definition.
Just one thing on that. Aristotle, of course, is recommending a mixed constitution, right? So he doesn't just want pure aristocracy. He wants a constitution which combines the best elements of all the good ones. And that's what he calls the so-called polity. And that actually gave rise to a long modern tradition of mixed constitutions where the idea was to mix the ingredients, right? Get some aristocratic stuff in there, get some moneyed people in there, those are the oligarchs, and get some Democrats in there, that's the people. So he comes down not so clearly on the aristocratic side, I think.
Right, and so to the extent that's true, that's actually fairly close to what we're arguing. Remember, what we're arguing for is a system that does have some democratic components, right? That's the way the US Constitution was originally set up. The US House was directly elected by the people, so the people would have direct representation in the national government, but it wouldn't be direct, unfettered representation in every part of it, right? So I think that's the critical distinction. I actually wanted to come back to your question because it was a very good one. So basically what you were saying, you were saying, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that people's social identities are wrapped up with their policy preferences or their policy interests, and so it's not, one can't separate out policy preferences from identities to the extent that I was trying to separate them, right? Is that basically what you were saying? Right. Right. So here's what I would say in response to that. First of all, so you originally brought up the issue of immigration, right? People who are immigrants or who are children of immigrants have a greater awareness of the immigration issue, and in that way, their personal identity informs their views on the issue, right? And I would agree. And immigration is actually a unique issue because immigration really does implicate one's social identity, one's social status in a very direct way. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look across American history, immigration is one of the few issues that has mobilized people into the political parties almost overnight, right? I mean, the most successful third-party movement in American history was a party that was known as the Know Nothing Party. They were a party that was opposed to immigration. They basically developed almost overnight in the early 1850s. Within a few years, they won a sixth of the seats in the US House of Representatives. We've never had a successful third-party movement of that magnitude since. So immigration is special because it is so wrapped up with identity. But on a lot of other issues, if you look carefully at the data, there really isn't a good link. There isn't a good connection between what you might think people's interests should be and what they say their policy views are. And in fact, what we see over and over again on issue after issue after issue is, to the extent people actually have policy preferences, they're forming them based on what the leaders of their political parties are advocating. Right? And so the clearest example of this is like public policy toward Russia. It's really interesting. If you look at survey research on public policy towards Russia, what should our foreign policy toward Russia be? 4 years ago, Republicans were all in favor of an aggressive policy toward Russia, right? And Democrats were all in favor of accommodation toward Russia. Today, it's flipped. Why? Well, because the leader of the Republican Party has adopted a pro-Russia stance, and Republican voters have followed him. And in response to the leader of the Republican Party adopting a pro-Russia stance, leaders of the other party have adopted an anti-Russia stance, and Democratic voters have followed them, right? So on issue after issue after issue, we see this. Voters follow the leaders, right? Their policy preferences are shaped by their party identities, not the other way around. It's a very troubling fact for democracy.
This is going to be our last question, our formal question, and then we encourage you guys to stay. There's some snacks in the back, and continue the informal questions for these guys up here. And I just want to thank everyone for their awesome questions and conversations. So, last question.
Good. All right, well, I'll try to be quick. This is going off of something Patrick said, but I'll open it up to anyone that wants to respond, especially since it's the last question. So one of the supposed advantages of the more majoritarian approach is that it's going to lead to moderation on the part of policy and policy advocacy from candidates. But why do we assume that moderation is a good thing? And let me give one dramatic example. So the Affordable Care Act attempted to strike a sort of moderate position between what we might think of as the extremes of a government-sponsored single-payer system on the one hand, and some sort of more open, industry-oriented market solution to our healthcare problems on the other hand. Instead, what we got is a Frankenstein's monster of privately provided health insurance regulated through various intricacies with lots more leeway for red states than what the extreme position on the left would have wanted, and lots more regulation and restriction on industry than what people on the right would have wanted. So why think moderation is a good thing, with that as our, I think, monstrous example of one of the things it results in?
I think I would say, if you're using the Affordable Care Act as an example, I think a lot of the problems with it came because of the lack of majoritarian structures. Had it been something that the majority was able to just decide, you would have had one of those two extremes, or something probably center left, center right. But because you had a Congress, which especially the Senate is built on non-majoritarianism, you had this horse trading. So you had people, Democrats who were more conservative Democrats from smaller rural states, who had an outsized vote than they should have based on population, smaller population, but they had a bigger vote. They made different deals about they would make the policy more conservative or get money for their state in exchange for things. And so I think because you had a system that wasn't truly majoritarian, you had this sort of horse trading Frankenstein sort of situation. And I think if the majority can decide, they'll come to a more cohesive single thing. And it's not going to leave everybody happy, but I think you are going to have a more cohesive thing, which then can be judged as good or bad, as opposed to this sort of murky, we like parts of it, we don't like parts of it, how are you going to decide situation.
I guess that concludes this debate. Thank you guys for coming.